مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. ماديسون كان لديه مبدأ يتعلق بالدفاع عن أمريكا الشمالية والجنوبية من أوروبا. أما ترومان فكان لديه مبدأ يتعلق بحماية أوروبا والشرق الأوسط من العدوان السوفيتي. نيكسون بدوره كان لديه مبدأ يدعو إلى تحمل حلفاء أمريكا المسؤولية الأساسية في الدفاع عن أمنهم. هذه مبادئ أسس تعكس رؤية الرئيس للعالم. هل لدى دونالد ترامب مبدأ يتبعه في شؤون السياسة الخارجية؟ وإن كان لديه فما هو؟ لمناقشة المبادئ وراء سياسة الرئيس ترامب الخارجية، يسرني أن أرحب بمحللين فذين من العالمين بشؤون واشنطن، وهما مايكل أوهانلون وجيمس أنتل. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. We've had them almost since the founding of the Republic. Madison had one, Truman had one, Nixon had one. They're called doctrines, foreign policy doctrines. Let's take a look this week with Michael O'Hanlon and James Antle at whether Donald Trump has his own. Mike, does Donald Trump have a foreign policy doctrine?
He has elements of a worldview. A doctrine implies a fairly strong, clear rule book that the president himself almost consults and refers to. I don't think we're there. I think you still see his gut, his emotion, his instinct in almost every first reaction to most problems. And in a way, if he has a doctrine, it's one that his advisors have to bring him back to each time on a big question like Syria or Afghanistan. So on balance, to call it a doctrine is a little strong, but I think he has elements of a worldview. He would like to see the United States strong, but not interventionist. That harkens back to Ronald Reagan in some ways, but he's in a much different place, of course, with all the wars going on. He doesn't believe in the free trade consensus that has certainly dominated much of his party, and yet he seems to want to deal with China and not to push the trade disagreements too far. So in the end, it's more of a course correction there. We could go down the list. I think you could say that there are certain elements of old-fashioned realism in his policy, but when you combine that with the way he talks, with his tweeting, with his gut instincts, there's no clear message that people can look to and see consistently. So, you know, now that it's 2 years in, we can begin to talk about a track record where you can add up the things that seem to fit with one set of views, and there may be, again, a little bit of an emerging set of tendencies or trends, but I would not go so far as to say a doctrine.
Okay, not yet. Jim, what do you think when you look at the first 2 years? Do you add up the individual parts, and do you see a sum that constitutes a doctrine?
Well, I think where President Trump has been most consistent, if you even go back and look at interviews he was doing in the 1980s, is that his worldview is animated by the idea that the United States is being treated unfairly by other countries, that foreigners have unfair advantages over the United States, that the U.S. is too generous in its dealings with the rest of the world to its detriment. And he believes that's true on trade, he believes that's true on foreign aid, he believes that's true of some of our treaty obligations and commitments, he believes that's true of our interventions overseas for humanitarian purposes. So to some extent, he has tried to forge that impulse into a coherent strategy and policy. You've seen him, I think, try to shrink the U.S. footprint in the Middle East, but with very inconsistent results. But that seems to be his inclination. His inclination is also to view China as a greater strategic threat than any power in the Middle East, than perhaps Russia. So he clearly believes that the intellectual property theft being done by China, he wants to change our trade relationship with China, but he's also tried to proceed, despite having some firm ideas on that, he's also tried to proceed somewhat carefully in that he realizes that Chinese retaliation could disproportionately affect states where he has been popular and where he needs, particularly in the farm states, these voters to turn out for him and down ballot Republicans in future elections. So he has tried to be a little bit pragmatic, I think, in some respects, but also he is very invested in the idea that when he, being this negotiator, he is, I think it's central to his self-conception that he is a deal maker. He wants to do what he did in real estate deals on the international stage. And so whether he is going to accomplish some of those things will, I think, really remain to be seen. But I think that's sort of what he is groping towards in terms of a grand strategy.
So perhaps one window in this is the fascinating letter that the then Secretary of Defense wrote in December when we had the first resignation of a major cabinet figure in 40 years, when Secretary Mattis said that the president deserves a Secretary of Defense more aligned with his own views. So clearly the president has strongly held views that the Secretary disagreed with. I imagine it wasn't just on the deployment in Syria. What do you think he was getting at?
Well, I think it's unusual. Typically, when you come in as a president of a party, you staff your administration with the people from the previous administration of your party who haven't yet aged out of government service. So you should be able to just take some people who served under George W. Bush, bump them up a level, and put them in a Donald Trump administration. What is different about this situation is Donald Trump and George W. Bush had very different foreign policy visions. So it's not entirely clear that you can take a John Bolton and other people from the George W. Bush national security team and have them seamlessly implement some of the policies that President Trump wants to pursue. And I think with Secretary Mattis, it was certainly clear that he did not share the president's view of some of our treaty obligations, of our NATO allies. He did not want, I think, he felt that we were going to be abandoning allies that we had in Syria who fought with us in the fight against ISIS in Syria. And the president has very different viewpoints on what those relationships should look like and what our priorities and what our obligations should be. And I think Mattis and I think a lot of other people have been somewhat successful in slow walking what the president wants to do and kind of slowing him down, but you can't really stop him. He is the guy in charge, so he does sort of keep moving in these directions, and at best you can kind of, kick the can down the road a little bit, delay him somewhat.
What do you think we learned from the Mattis resignation?
Well, I think this was very well said, but I also think it's striking that after Mattis left, Trump moved back towards Mattis's positions on Syria and Afghanistan. And one way to look at it is slow walking and the national security consensus in general and the Republican consensus, but shared by many Democrats, pulling Trump back. But he's also 2 years in. He's got more confidence in his role as commander-in-chief. He was already having a distancing with his former Secretary of Defense. Right. And you would have thought, if anything, the process might have accelerated after Mattis's departure, but it didn't. It slowed down. And frankly, in some ways, the way President Trump talks about the Middle East is not unlike the way President Obama talked about the Middle East. They both wanted out wherever we could, and they both kept finding that it just wasn't quite possible. And so I actually am struck by the similarities between Obama and Trump, two very different people, two very different politicians. But on the Middle East, they both have the same desire not to get bogged down and both the same difficulty really getting out.
Now, in your definition of the sort of amorphous emerging Trump worldview, sounded very similar to what the New York Times recently characterized Secretary of State Mike Pompeo as frugal realism. Not wanting to spend a lot, but realistic about America's, sort of limited and realistic about America's engagements abroad. Does that ring true to you?
I think it does, and I think Mr. Pompeo is a very gifted and smart guy. But I also sort of like the places where President Trump doesn't always agree with Pompeo. We were talking earlier about North Korea policy, and I've been writing this week, as myself a Democrat and a Trump critic, that I actually like the overall gist of where we are now on North Korea strategy, because I think Trump's unusual personal diplomacy creates an opportunity and also prevents a complete deterioration in the relationship, while at the same time we keep turning the screws on the sanctions until we get a proposal from Kim Jong-un that is reasonable. But one thing that I don't believe either Mr. Pompeo or John Bolton would ever agree to is a deal that would sort of let North Korea keep some of their nuclear weapons, but maybe eliminate their production capability in exchange for a partial lifting of sanctions. But I think President Trump would agree to that deal.
When we come back after the break, we're going to take a look at whether the administration is making the pivot from an era in which we focused on sub-state actors like terrorist groups to great power competition. In just a moment. Our guests today include Michael O'Hanlon. He is the Director of Foreign Policy Research at the Brookings Institution, where he specializes in U.S. national security policy. An adjunct professor at Columbia, Georgetown, and Syracuse universities, his books include Beyond NATO, A New Security Architecture for Eastern Europe, and Bending History, Barack Obama's Foreign Policy. Sitting to his left is W. James Antle III. Jim Antle is editor of the American Conservative magazine. Previously, he managed a team of reporters as politics editor at the conservative Washington Examiner and served as managing editor of the Daily Caller. He is the author of the book, Devouring Freedom: Can Big Government Ever Be Stopped? All right, gentlemen. The national security strategy recently articulated a new approach, or a new set of challenges, that is, for American foreign policy, urging the government to move away from a focus on sub-state actors, terrorist groups, to great power competition, peer competitors Russia and China. Has the administration made that pivot in how it approaches national security questions, Jim?
Well, I think certainly the president is very focused on China. So to that extent, I think it has. Obviously, a lot of our actual military intervention is still focused on non-state actors. We're fighting ISIS and on multiple theaters. And I think that's still where public opinion and still where a lot of the president's base is, that they want to be active against the types of terrorists who launched the 9/11 attacks against the United States. But certainly there is a growing focus on China. There's a growing focus on Russia. I think that the scandal from the campaign, the investigation by Robert Mueller in terms of whether there was any coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia as it tried to sway public opinion during the 2016 presidential campaign, that I think has to some extent limited the degree to which this president wants to speak in a hostile manner about Russia. I think because he views the Trump-Russia affair as something that is used to discredit or delegitimize his election victory. But a lot of the people under President Trump have certainly been very hawkish on Russia. I can't really think of anybody in a position of significant authority on national security affairs who is not more or less a Russia hawk, and I would include both John Bolton and Mike Pompeo as people who take a fairly hard line on Russia. Rex Tillerson, who was considered to be somebody, the former Secretary of State, who was considered to be somebody who might be somewhat soft on Russia, actually was not during his tenure as Secretary of State and was very critical of the Russian government on a number of fronts. But I think that the president's main focus has really been on China, because both because of a lot of concerns he shares with other Republicans, but also because of his economic focus and his focus on the idea that we are being treated unfairly by these other foreign governments. I think China really tops his lists of foreign governments he thinks are taking advantage of the United States.
If I could just add in,
Sure,
that was very well said, and I agree with virtually all of it, but two caveats. One is that, and this builds on what you were saying earlier about President Trump's views on Vladimir Putin. President Trump has a certain Henry Kissinger-like respect for power. And some people think it's just because he likes autocrats, because he's sort of a bully himself. That's sort of what his political critics say. And there may even be some truth to that in terms of his personality. But I also think in terms of his foreign policy worldview, he has an old-fashioned realist streak. And he actually is, like Kissinger, someone who feels an affinity towards Putin and Xi, and which somewhat mitigates the effort to pivot towards great power competition. And in that regard, he's different from most of his national security team. Henry Kissinger is, in one regard, thought of as a great in American foreign policy, but he's also fairly unusual in that he has this sort of innate respect for power, even when it's somebody else's power. Most American foreign policy strategists don't really think that way. Second is on the defense budget. If we were really shifting towards great power competition, you would arguably see bigger changes in how we are building the military. And this is my main area of professional specialization. And when I look around at defense budgets like the one we're now seeing and debating with the administration's new release, it is higher in dollar terms under President Trump than it had been in the latter Obama years. But the priorities aren't that different. We're not seeing, for example, more emphasis on long-range bombers. We're still planning to buy the same number of B-21 bombers that we were going to buy under Obama, even though if you were shifting towards competition with China, you arguably might need more. You might see a more rapid focus on the submarine force because it's more survivable than carriers in an era. Anyway, I don't want to get too technocratic, but I don't see big shifts yet. And it builds on Jim's point that we still sort of are bogged down in the Middle East and with Korea, whether we like it or not. And to some extent, it limits the room for maneuver and transformation.
Let me ask you about one issue which is big on our foreign policy agenda that's not in the Middle East or in Asia or in Europe, and that's Venezuela. The administration has not made democracy a theme anywhere in the world except in Venezuela. What is so unique about this example? Why is it pushing for internal political change there? And isn't this going to feed the desire of the demand of Democrats around the world saying, please, Mr. Trump, look at us, help us out too?
I'm happy to go first or let you on this one.
I mean, it does seem to be a little bit of a departure from the America First rhetoric, even though I think you can make an argument that what's going on in our region has greater national security concern. There's more of a national interest at stake than perhaps in some of the Middle East. So you can somewhat reconcile it, but certainly a good part of it has to do with the socialist character of the Venezuelan government. Some of it has to do with it being a major concern of Florida Republicans. Florida is a very important state for the president's reelection, and Marco Rubio and other Republican leaders in Florida have taken, because of their constituents, a very keen interest in what's going on in Venezuela. And it does even to some extent tie in. I think you saw in the State of the Union address the president talking about the appeal of democratic socialism within the Democratic Party. It kind of gets you back to pre-Trump republicanism, old school Cold War republicanism, where you're sort of saying, I don't like these commies abroad, and I think the liberals at home are a little bit pink too, and so there's a little bit of domestic consumption, I think, going on. And then some, I think, of the president's critics would probably point to oil in Venezuela as perhaps an incentive for us to have an interest in what kind of government they have over there. So I think a variety of those things come into play. But yes, you do run the risk of one, is this a little bit of a contradiction given the supposed America First orientation of the president's foreign policy, and two, are you going to make some of the migration crises that are clearly a major factor in how the president won, and something that Trump has said that he wants to get under control from a U.S. perspective, are you going to make some of these migration crises worse if the government of another country in that region becomes so unstable?
Interesting.
And again, that's well said, but I would also add one more point, and this is actually in defense of the president, even more strongly than Jim perhaps, which is we waited 6 years to see if, or longer than 6, to see if anything could improve in Venezuela. And most of us in both parties were trying to ignore it. We were just too busy with everything else. But Maduro has managed to take that country into such an incredible hyperinflation spiral downward. I think it was 2 million% inflation rate the last I checked. The country is imploding. This is before the imposition of the U.S. sanctions. So there was no path towards sort of a soft landing or even, just a gradual descent into wallowing in their misery. This is a flat-out collapse of the Venezuelan state. And in a way, we're taking the gamble that by making it worse in the short term, we can hopefully incentivize Venezuelans themselves and others around them to push harder for change and make Maduro realize, or his military realize, that something's got to give. It's a risky strategy, but I have to say I applaud it, because I was one of those people trying to ignore Venezuela for a decade, and that strategy just wasn't working either.
So we've got you on record supporting North Korea, supporting Venezuela. Some of your colleagues are going to wonder whose side you're really on.
I'm still wearing a pink shirt. So.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us in Dakhla, Washington. I appreciate you offering your insights into what make Donald Trump's foreign policy really tick.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
We support our troops in a variety of ways. We're always trying to find ways to bring a touch of home, a touch of America, and a touch of the affection and appreciation of the American people to them. And we do that through our entertainment programs. We send large care packages for groups of military personnel who are deployed in areas where they might not otherwise have access to entertainment, means of communicating with their children and spouses back at home. And then another tangible means we use is through our smaller care packages, and that's why we're here today. We're going to be assembling about 2,000 care packages. They're small snack packs about this big, and they contain a variety of products that our service members have told us they really miss, these little tangible pieces of America when they're deployed. It includes items like candy, hand wipes, flavored powder that you can put into water, nuts, that sort of thing.
Many people in America are absolutists. It's their party, right or wrong, their candidate, right or wrong, their president, right or wrong. I respect that. Loyalty to party is perfectly fine, as long as it is subordinated to loyalty to country. But that's not my approach. I haven't met a single person in public life whose views agree with mine on every issue. Well, I certainly don't agree with either political party 100%, or even 80 or 90% of the time. Given that I often change my mind after learning more about a topic, it's almost impossible for anyone to have an identical set of views as I do. Well, so too with President Trump's foreign policy. I appreciated his desire to improve ties with Middle East allies after the distancing of those relationships during the Obama administration. But I didn't appreciate the purposeful distancing from European allies that seemed to take our alliances in the opposite direction. I appreciated his decision on the Iran nuclear deal, which I always considered a flawed agreement. But I regretted his reluctance to maintain a robust, if still minimal, presence in northeastern Syria that would have stymied Iran's efforts to spread its malevolent influence throughout the region. I appreciated his getting tough with China on trade, which repairs a passive approach going back years. But I regretted his decision to undo trade deals with other Pacific allies that would have only strengthened our position in the face of Beijing. And I appreciated his desire to inject more clarity and meritocracy into America's immigration policy. But I very much regretted his decision to severely limit access to America for the world's much abused asylum seekers. I understand why the president is concerned with infiltration of terrorists from places like Syria or Libya. But horrible crimes are committed against innocents around the world. Should the Rohingya of Myanmar lack access to America because of the fear of ISIS infiltration? I go down this list to underscore a simple point. Foreign policy is complicated. I agree with some decisions, I disagree with others. It was the same with President Trump's predecessor, and it will be the same with his successor. It's called democracy. بهذا نصل نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول المبادئ التي تسترشد بها السياسة الخارجية في بلدكم، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.